Let me talk about your book. The book is comprised of 18 mottos that, as you write in the book, have storied histories that drove leaders at the time to make certain profound decisions. And I know they've guided your career in the Navy and beyond as a leader. And one of those mottos is, when in command, command. Right. And that's something you heard when you were here, not when you were in the Navy, but when you were here at UT. What's the significance of that phrase, Bill?
Yeah, in fact, I was a midshipman here going through the Naval ROTC program, and in the very first semester of Naval ROTC, you get Navy history. And so we talk about all the great naval battles out there, but the young lieutenant who was teaching the class at the time talked to us about Chester Nimitz. And of course, Nimitz, born and raised in Fredericksburg, so there was a connection immediately with UT. But he told us about the time in 1942. So the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor in 1941. In 1942, now Nimitz is debating whether he is going to engage the Japanese fleet at this tiny little island in the Pacific called Midway. Well, most of his staff thought it was a bad idea, thought it was a trap, and oh, by the way, if we lost any more ships after Pearl Harbor, it could be disastrous. And frankly, the Pentagon at the time did not think it was a good idea either. So Nimitz is really grappling with this, should I try to engage the Japanese fleet in Midway? And he goes to see one of his closest friends, Admiral Bull Halsey, and Halsey at the time had shingles, and he was in the hospital in Pearl Harbor. So Nimitz goes to see him, and he tells him about his dilemma, and he says, you know, I just don't know what to do. And Halsey was this kind of gruff old admiral, and he says, well, Admiral, you used to tell me, when in command, command. And the point was, you're in charge, take charge, make the hard decisions, because that's what people expect when you are the commander. If I can fast forward just for a minute. So fast forward about, 40 plus years from that point in time. I am now the commander, I'm a 4-star admiral, I'm the commander of U.S. Special Operations Command, and it had historically been an Army command. I am on my way out for about a 3-week trip, and again, there's a lot of Army paraphernalia, although the guy before me was an admiral, predominantly Army paraphernalia around. So on my way out, of the office, I kind of dismissively said to my chief mess sergeant there, I said, get me something, I don't know, naval. I need something naval in here. I'm a Navy guy, get me something naval. And she just kind of nodded, and I took off on a 3-week trip. Well, I come back after 3 weeks, and I walk back into my office, and there's this big desk in here, and there's a conference table. And I said, walked back out, I said, Dana, what is this? She said, well, you told me to get you something naval. It's Nimitz's desk. I said, what? And she smiled, and she goes, yeah, the Naval Archives gave us his desk and his conference table. And the reason that was important to me, for 3 years, I sat behind that desk. And whenever I thought about the difficult decisions that I had to make, I thought how they paled in comparison to the decisions that Nimitz had to make. And it always came back to me, hey, when in command, command.
You talked about swim buddies.
Yeah.
And that's one of the other lessons here is always have a swim buddy. Right. Is another chapter here. As you just talked about with Nimitz and Halsey, right? Yeah. The swim buddy in a sense. What does that mean in the culture of the Navy SEALs? What does a swim buddy mean? But the broader meaning too of swim buddy. Yeah.
So when you go through SEAL training, for safety purposes, you are never by yourself. And frankly, when I went through, they were all Vietnam veterans that were my instructors, and they made sure you understood. Look, I don't care where you are. You always have a partner. You always have a swim buddy. And when you are actually going through training and you are diving, scuba diving, you are actually attached by a line, a short line, to your swim buddy. And so you have to work together, but your swim buddy is also there to make sure if you're underneath a ship that you don't get tangled in lines, that if you run out of air, he's going to take his regulator, share his air with you. And this idea of a swim buddy in the SEAL teams, it starts with your swim buddy underwater, but it's also when you're parachuting, in the middle of the night. It's your swim buddy who kind of parachutes beside you and lands in, enemy territory together. It's, oh, by the way, it's your swim buddy that checks your parachute before you jump. When you are kind of patrolling and you're out on the ground, you know who your swim buddy is. They're the ones that are checking your six to make sure the enemy doesn't come. And it is this idea that I don't care who you are, you need a swim buddy in life. You know, whether it is your spouse, whether it is your close colleague, you know, no matter who it is, you have to have somebody you can, you know, trust implicitly. And oh, by the way, you know, you've got to be prepared to take the criticism. You know, I talk about in this chapter, I had this command sergeant major, a very senior enlisted, the senior enlisted in my organization named Chris Ferris. And Chris fought in Mogadishu during Black Hawk Down. He chased Pablo Escobar in South America. He fought in Bosnia. He fought in Iraq and Afghanistan, probably one of the most experienced enlisted men in the special operations community. He was my right-hand man. I didn't make a major decision without talking to Ferris. But there were times when, you know, I needed somebody. I was having a bad day. Most of the time, it was tough love. It was like, hey, suck it up, Admiral. You know, there are guys out there that are dying on the battlefield. We don't care about your, you know, your little problems. And sometimes you needed that. And then every once in a while, it was the man hug by the fire. It'll be all right, boss. You know, that didn't go well, but it'll be all right. You need those guys.
Another chapter is titled Run Toward the Sound of the Guns.
Right.
And to illustrate this, you talk about a Maine professor, a professor from Bowdoin College, named Joshua Chamberlain, who played a vital role at the Battle of Gettysburg. Tell us a little bit about Joshua Chamberlain and his significance.
Yeah, so the point of the chapter of Run to the Sound of Guns really, I think, is exemplified by Joshua Chamberlain. So as Mark said, you know, college professor gets called up to lead the 20th Maine during the Civil War. And Chamberlain, not a career soldier, but he gets put in charge of the 20th Maine, kind of pulls them together as a fighting unit. But in early July of 1863, the Union forces arrive at this small town in Pennsylvania called Gettysburg. And within the next day, the Confederate forces show up in Gettysburg as well. And the Union forces have arrayed their men, their soldiers, along what's called Cemetery Ridge. It's a little bit of the high ground in Gettysburg. And the Confederate forces under John B. Hood show up at Robert E. Lee and Hood, really where Cemetery Ridge is. And tactically, from the military standpoint, you know, if you can break the center, then you can split the forces and your chances of defeating the enemy are much larger. So John Gary realizes that Hood wants to break the center, so he takes the folks from the flanks, particularly from the left flank where the 20th Maine is, and he moves them to the center. But in doing that, he exposes the left flank of Cemetery Ridge, deeply exposes the left flank. Well, Hood sees an opportunity, because the only thing worse than breaking the center is turning the line. Again, tactical terms, if you can get to one side of the enemy or the other, and you turn them where your forces are sweeping down and they're in a line perpendicular to you, you're going to win. And so Hood realizes, here's a chance. He gets 3 or 4 times the force necessary, and he charges up what's called Little Round Top at the left flank of Cemetery Ridge. And Joshua Chamberlain is there. He has already been wounded by shrapnel once, maybe twice at that point in time. And now the rebel forces are making their way up the hill. They are about to take Little Round Top and turn the line. Chamberlain realizes he has got to lead his forces into the teeth of the Confederate forces. He draws his sword, yells to the men to fix bayonet, and he leads the charge down the hill against the rebel forces and pushes back the rebel forces that day and saves Little Round Top. Now you think about that for just 1 minute. So Joshua Chamberlain, one man, because he ran to the sound of guns, because he attacked the problem head on, didn't retreat, he knew he had to go right into the teeth of the problem, he saves Little Round Top. In saving Little Round Top, he saved Cemetery Ridge. In saving Cemetery Ridge, he saved the Battle of Gettysburg. In saving the Battle of Gettysburg, he probably saved the Union, and in saving the Union, he saved America and saved the world. Think about that. One man, one man's decision. So the lesson from this particular chapter is, look, as a leader, you have to run to the sound of guns. When you see a problem, you can't decide that, you know what, if I start to try to solve that problem, then people are going to blame me on it. Sorry about that. You're the person in charge. Move to where the problem is, because sometimes only the leader can solve the problem. Yes, you're going to get dirty. Yes, you're going to get tainted. Yes, you're going to get painted with the same brush. But sorry, that's your responsibility. Move to where the problem is and do the best you can to solve it.